Okay, so we have Scott Martin. He is the Executive Director of River Heritage Conservancy in Indiana, which is a nonprofit that is building a 400-acre park on the North Shore of the Ohio River in the Louisville metro region. Prior to Scott's work, he served as the Parks Director for the Parklands of Floyd County. He has spent the last 20 years expanding public access to paddling adventures in urban and suburban settings across 6 river systems and over 50 miles of waterways. Scott Shipley is the engineer and founder of S2O Design and Engineering. He is among the best known American kayakers in the world today and a veteran of 3 Olympic Games and also the holder of 4 world titles. He has combined expertise in both whitewater and engineering design, which has made him the go-to designer for some of the world's most demanding whitewater design projects. He is working all over the world in Africa and the Middle East, and notably has designed the 2012 Olympic venue, which is the U.S. National Whitewater Center and is the largest whitewater park in the world. So we are very happy to welcome both Scott here today, and I will now turn our attention to them. Thank you.
Great, thanks Hannah. This is Scott Martin. I'll get started. I'm going to do about, 10 slides is kind of Whitewater 101, and then Scott's going to jump into what I'm sure you're all here for, which is his expertise on designing these features and these amenities in your community. We'll come back to some operational considerations and then take any questions from there. Does that work for you, Mr. Shipley?
It does. Yeah, let's get started.
All right, so we'll jump right into it. This is our intended learnings today. Y'all read it as well as anybody. The key takeaway we want probably to share with y'all is that this sort of stuff is doable, and it's not as crazy as it may have once seemed due to a couple of factors that we're going to explore. And then if you go into this with your eyes wide open and with some situational awareness and awareness of your audiences, these are accomplishable for any size community. It's just a question of scale and operations from there. So I'll jump in. I'm going to do a little Presbyterian minister kind of vibe here for you. I hope you don't mind, but there's a little bit of evangelizing in here. As we know, I think all of us, is there are a variety of challenges in all of our developed worlds and first world societies right now. It feels like in a lot of ways, we're tearing apart a little bit. And I think we all as parks professionals agree that the resources we provide are actually a great platform for people to come back together. And I think Whitewater is one of those. I've seen it work in rural and urban communities. There's just something special about Whitewater where you can have, like this New Yorker showed, 2 different worlds coming together that may not have thought about coming together beforehand, because this is what results if we do our job right. There's something about the Whitewater experience where it doesn't care if you're a Fortune 100 CEO or a 17-year-old barista. It's going to treat you the same way. And I know Scott and I share the same passion for what that experience can deliver to folks. There's just something special about it. Because it takes communities from this, which, whatever, and turns them into active. And this is what we're all about, because doing and experiencing is better than just being a spectator, which is what we're all into. What's really neat to me, and the reason I got to work with Scott on a variety of projects now, is, Whitewater Rec used to involve a lot of work. So, you'd have to load up the family vehicle, make a big trip, and eventually you get to the river and it would look something like a National Geographic expedition, and that's cool. Don't get us wrong. We love that. That has value. But what Scott and his industry have been able to bring to our marketplace is a revolution of bringing these features into our urban cores, because a lot of our cities exist because there was a natural obstruction on a waterway that meant you probably had to get out and go around a whitewater feature. We built on these rivers for a reason, and we use them for a variety of purposes, mostly industrial and the developed world. And now we're starting to twist back and say, how can these cities that have these water resources get them active and use them in a new way? And with Scott and the variety of folks in his industry, they've revolutionized and recreated what it means to have outdoor rec. And then they've invented these man-made whitewater and outdoor recreation centers like Charlotte, the photo below that he'll go into in great detail, that have really taken it to the next level. And this is totally different than anything else I think we've seen in our industry in some time, because we're able to build adventure space in close proximity. lots and lots of people in a way that's financially responsible. So that's the revolution. The second thing that I like as Parks and Rec director is the unique visibility of paddle sports. You know, I love hiking, wonderful, and if you build hiking trails, you know, you get out and then they drive home in their cars and what I've learned in rural and urban settings, though, is the wonderful little factor of boats on top of cars means the impact of whitewater and paddling extends out. It just has profound experience at rebranding your community and what a lifestyle means when people around town in their neighborhood see boats on cars. And it's sometimes just as simple as that. It's kind of just a real big kick that says, hey, this is something different that we can do that's really interesting. So I like that. We're talking about urban parks, and apologies if this is rote to y'all, but I'm going to jump through it. We are in an urban center, and we're just getting more and more urban. Every projection going forward is that hundreds of millions of more people are going to move into cities. I think in the parks business, how do we reorient and how do we deliver park services in an increasingly urban environment, which is why I'm active in World Urban Parks, and a bunch of y'all are as well. Our cities not only are growing inward, you know, we spend a lot of time talking about our hip urban cores. Well, I love the visual because it shows that the cities not only are growing up, but they're continuing to grow out. Yellow there on those on the charts, if you can see it, they look like amoeba. But that shows the footprint of some of our larger cities across the globe and how they've grown out over the last 25 years. And why am I talking about this now? Well, it relates to outdoor recreation as well, because we're starting to move into areas that, if we hadn't beforehand, have river and water systems now. So you can actually think through what you want those rivers on your urban edge to be before the growth gets there. And that'll give you a different approach than maybe we did 100, 150 years ago when we went through an industrialized period on our urban waterfronts. So this is a nice roundabout way, I hope I'm not babbling too much, that cities have existing water resources in their cores in many instances that can be reprogrammed, but we also should be looking towards our edges where natural systems are and saying, how do we want to reprogram, reorient, and use those waterways as well for recreation in a way that's ecologically sustainable and healthy. So, in cities, the tendency that I found with whitewater and any real specialized deal is the hunch or the feeling we get is maybe the big stuff is just for big cities or it's just for wealthy cities. And I don't think that's true, because if you look at the chart up there about where our global cities live, and draw your attention to a couple quick things. The majority of our urban residents live in cities with fewer than 300,000 people. And I've seen Scott and the folks build amenities just like this in those smaller size cities. So there's a way to activate those. On the other hand, our larger cities are medium size, where the second largest proportion is, they can sometimes support the whitewater centers that are a little bit more of an investment platform. So it's not just, you know, your New York, your Hong Kong that can do this. It can be scalable to the size of city you're in. And again, with the urban growth we're having, there's an opportunity there for success. Stepping away from that, again, this is kind of just Outdoor Rec 101. The state of outdoor recreation as a whole, this is a U.S. viewpoint, so I'm sorry I don't have the global numbers to share with you. But what are we seeing in terms of outdoor rec? Well, we're seeing pretty much stable participation numbers. There hasn't been substantial growth or decline. It appears fairly level in terms of participation. I don't think that's a surprise to us. Sometimes it feels like it to those that aren't when they see the latest Outside magazine, or they see, you know, we saw Free Solo win a big award a couple weeks ago, but the participation numbers are pretty much stable. What's interesting, again, to the urban connection, though, is take a look at this. The bulk of participation, if you have a commitment to outdoor recreation, is if it is close to home. So it makes common sense that everyone in Boulder, Colorado, all due respect to our friends there, you know, they do outdoor rec because it's there. The challenge we have as outdoor recreation professionals is how do we bring that commitment to communities that didn't have it before, because we think it makes for a healthier and better community to live in. And what's interesting, you know, is when we think about outdoor rec, you know, the trend, look at, you know, in the U.S. at least, the mountain region or the Pacific coast, and go, that's where everyone that's hip and fit and has 2% body fat, and they do the outdoor rec and then they drink IPAs. Well, the data set shows that the bulk of outdoor recreation, though, still occurs where the population centers are. And in the U.S., that's the South Atlantic, which is shocking, because that's like our Kentucky Fried Chicken belt. So this doesn't say that you have to live in Colorado or California to do outdoor rec. People everywhere want to do it if we make it accessible, safe, enjoyable, and something that people can consume close to home. And that's kind of the big takeaway from today as well. Now, when we drill down, and I'm going to press on this a little bit, when we drill down, though, into outdoor rec and we ask where is the growth, take a look at these numbers, again, from the same data set from the Outdoor Industry Association. We are seeing growth in moving water activities. I think Scott would probably have some interesting insights here. I think the rec paddling revolutions had a lot to do with this. Stand-up paddleboarding's had a lot to do with this. But what we are seeing is an increase in it. And that fits with some of the data we're seeing from millennials and even Gen X, is consumers are increasingly shifting their spending. This is from the McKinsey Group. 6.3% growth in experience-related services. People are swapping out shopping, it appears, which they can increasingly do at home on a computer, for things that they do together and that are memory makers. But then take a look at that little yellow ball there at the bottom of the screen. This is interesting to me as a parks, particularly in the urban setting. What's happening is they're making these choices if they can use it as part of a day. Again, not the Griswold family vacation to Wally World. If they can make it a one-day deal, if they can make it close to where they live, strength of local real estate, and then if we remove barriers to entry for these experiences, we're making these purchases easier. And Scott will build on that with some of the experiences he's had at whitewater parks and urban settings as well. When we look at whitewater, changing chapters, most of y'all know, but I'm just going to go through it as a 101. We always talk about the water, and we go into language very quickly, and this will be up, and you can share it later date, but most of y'all know, there's class 1 through 5 in terms of whitewater experience, going from easiest, this from American Whitewater. There's an international standard that goes 1 through 6, but they generally align. And you're going to hear this a lot, and the reason I say this and bring this up is, for whatever reason, like any extreme sport, the push always seems to be these radical folks doing crazy moves and huge waterfalls, and just how tough somehow defines the quality of the experience. And Scott and I would disagree together. We really are a class 2, class 3 world. And if we build in these accessible, enjoyable, still feel challenging, you still have this outside your comfort zone experience, we think that's where the magic, and I use the word magic intentionally, the magic of the sport really takes shape. Is provide this thing that is wild and crazy at your heart, in your soul, may not be the extreme double black diamond run, but feels that way to our consumers. And we think that's where we can build in this community that enjoys the sport for a lifetime. When it comes to whitewater, there's more than one way to enjoy the sport, and that's what this slide attempts to display. You've all seen, I'm sure, the kayakers and the open canoers and paddle boards have come on. I don't know what those people are doing there on the surfboards. But
we've all seen lederhosen surfers.
Lederhosen surfers in your community. And then inflatables, of course, which for whatever reason tend to be the intro level to whitewater for a lot of folks, or at least that's the visual. But this is a long way of saying there's a lot of ways to enjoy this sport, which makes it different than a lot of other sports that we deliver in recreation. Each one of these things on a whitewater feature produces a different experience for the participant. And that's far different than what we see going forward. And then we have this, I don't really know what you do with it.
Well, and I think that's a good point to make, because when we start to say, look, our objective is to get more people outdoors and active and get more people engaged in these healthy, active outdoor lifestyles, you have to create that gateway to it. People aren't going to jump in and do that class 5 on the first try. And when we built some of our earlier whitewater parks, especially the U.S. National Whitewater Center, which was branded as this Olympic brand, and of course that held the Olympic team trials, one of the things we learned is most people came down to watch. 1 out of 10 people actually got wet, and it's the same reason that you and I don't show up to a bobsled track with a skin-tight suit on and spiked shoes, right? Because they're not going to let us run down that track with the bobsled on. And I think most people show up at these whitewater parks and say, maybe that's not for me, but I'd love to see what's going on. So we've learned to start to design these things towards that higher end for its marketing cachet, but also towards that accessible end, so that somebody can show up and say, hey, I went rafting, that was my gateway to it, and now I'm going to do kayaking or surfing or stand-up paddleboard. And that's where you start to build a community around your park. I think it's very important to think of all those users. So somebody, if you could, is driving, and if you could put it on mute, that would be fantastic.
There we go. Whitewater, for those of y'all that aren't as familiar with it, when you look at it from the outside, it looks the same, but there really are 3 types of activities on there for programming. And each one of these is a different discipline, but the same user group will do a little bit of each. But these are important elements to get familiar with on your own time for what shapes the activity you're building, because to Scott's point, which was great, each one of these attracts a little different user, but it also attracts a lot different spectator. Some of these are more spectator friendly than others, and more lifestyle centered. So getting familiar with these different communities, and it's not quite as tribal from my experience as surfers who kind of, own their space and own their waves. But these are different communities and different activities, and actually are different engineered features that Scott will detail in a bit as well. So there's different stuff going on in the water than may be known. With that, that's kind of Whitewater 101. I'll now turn it over to Mr. Shipley. Oh.
Thanks for that. And one of the things that happens with our company is people call up and they say, look, I'm very passionate about whitewater, but I've moved to Toledo, or I've moved to Topeka, and I would like to bring whitewater in, but I don't know how to get it done. And part of that process is, as Scott said, understanding your community and understanding who's going to use that park, how they're going to use it, but also understanding what those resources are that you have to build on. And so in some cases, such as in Charlotte, North Carolina, there wasn't a lot there to start with. They didn't have a whitewater community. It was a NASCAR community and a banking community. At the same time, they didn't have whitewater. There weren't the rivers that you see in a lot of these Colorado towns. And so one solution that we do, and this is the U.S. National Whitewater Center that you're looking at, is we're able to come into a community and actually build an entire river system from scratch. And so that pump station pumps about 1,200 cubic feet per second, between 12 and 1,400 cubic feet per second. We can fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool in about 15 seconds with that pump station. So tremendous amount of flow, but different than a water slide park or a theme park. There's no pirate ships, there's no Mickey Mouse, there's no nothing. Once that water hits the top pond, it flows naturally down all those channels. And we really recreate this very natural river whitewater experience. And what's great about that is we can bring it into these inner city communities without worrying about whether or not they have an existing river, or worrying about whether or not the resources there to run that year round. And so this is a great way to bring that recreation. And as Scott had shown earlier, with everybody moving to the cities and with everybody trying to recreate within about 10 miles of their home, this is a great way to make these outdoor recreation activities accessible from where people live. So it's not that long vacation to go to the Rocky Mountains or the Appalachians. It's something they can make part of their weekly and daily lives from day to day. Charlotte was so successful in that way that they actually added about 20 to 25 other activities. There's zip lines and climbing walls and running trails and mountain biking. And so people come out there and do everything from yoga in the woods to extreme mountain biking to whitewater. And it starts to become a part of their daily lives and their daily culture in much the same way that a clubhouse, a golf clubhouse might have been in years past. So these pump parks are one of the resources. And we can build these in very small, for the small and medium-sized cities, up to very large. Charlotte's about a $60 million bill in today's dollars. And so depending on the size of your market and usage, that's the kind of thing that can really lead to a lot of usage in those big cities. Go ahead and advance it if you would. Scott, if you can advance it. Oh, there we go. And this just puts a face to a name, but this is that same Whitewater Center, close into where the restaurant and retail and buildings are. We built, is where we put the competition channel. And so we're able to host large events. So you have this overlay, which is the competition or event overlay, as well as that day-to-day usage. On the flip side, and I've shown a quick graphic here from the Durango Whitewater Park, which we built a few years back. If you have a community that does have that natural resource, the river is flowing through town, you do have the gradient that you need to build it. Then you have this ability to build something quite cheaply and quite quickly that can create recreation in that existing river corridor. In some places, like in Reno Whitewater Park, that town or city has turned their back on that whitewater resource and favored what's going on in the city and gambling and things like that. And they're now coming back and saying, hey, this is a real resource that we've ignored. How do we restore it? And in that case, we're tearing down concrete walls. We're rebuilding natural river edges. We're coming in and taking what used to be a dam and turning that into a series of drop structures that are able to be navigated by fish on their way upstream, but also navigated by whitewater paddlers as they go down. And it starts to become a focal part of your community. And Scott, if you advance that again, you start to see where we take what was otherwise a fairly highly impacted river, and we're able to create places for people to access. We can tie it to a local community park. These parks are universally owned by the local municipality, whether it's a city or a town or a county. And so it creates a community space where people can go out at higher water and surf in kayaks, then go out in lower water and play in tubes or float through on rafts and these sorts of things. It often becomes the focal point of a river festival or a competition that starts to drive that local economy. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward as well. When we start to look at how we design these things, we think about a lot of things. And for me, one of the big ones is, how do we create that unique and special place that people will come to, not just from your own community? We want to create a community resource, but at the same time, we want to create something that brands your town so that people who are one town or two towns or a state away say, look, I want to go in and see that. I want to be there for an event, or I want to take part in what's going on there. And so what's neat about, especially these larger pump parks, but also for the in-stream parks, is that you create a brand around it. And one of the funny things we've run into now, after having built Charlotte, we opened that park in about 2006. We built it into a banking town, and you were more likely to see a pinstripe suit in that town than you were a kayak by about a factor of 2,000. And so, so at the end of the day, that town has now become a terrific outdoor town with a very active outdoor and passionate outdoor community that's there. And we'll go into another community and say, look, we can build this and we can bring this lifestyle to people that live here. We can bring this brand to your town. And they say, look, we're not a Charlotte. We can't do that here. You can't change us to be there. It's like, you want to say, you should have seen Charlotte before we started. So the idea of creating this brand that starts to say, hey, that's a river town. And that's been particularly true for a lot of these towns, such as Reno or such as Lyons, Colorado, or Durango, Colorado, where people are saying, hey, I saw it in a magazine, or I saw it in 10 best places to go for your summer break, and I want to go play in that whitewater river, or I want to live in that town. So creating that brand is a big part of what's going on. One of the big drivers, and this is really what helps people get these built in their town, is what we found is these parks have a tremendous economic impact to the towns in which they're in. And so when you look at even small whitewater parks like the one in Golden, Colorado, which is one of the kind of prototypical whitewater parks that was built, it has about a $2.2 million per year economic impact. And to me, that was strange, because most of the kayakers I know are sleeping in their car and they can't pull their pants up and put a belt on. And you say, golly, where are the dollars and cents coming from? But they run out there with people with clipboards, and they take actual survey data, which is sort of the gold standard, and they're saying, hey, I saw you out there tubing today. Did you come to town to do that? Did you stay in a hotel? Did you eat in a restaurant? And what it turns out is these parks are driving millions of dollars in business to the local businesses, the restaurants and the hotels and the shops that are there. And so it has a big impact. And when you talk about branding, Reno in its first 6 months had about $1 million in free advertising from the park that they built. It was in the Christian Science Monitor. It was on NBC News. It's big news when these things are built. And then people come out to visit, especially in Reno, where you're losing your money while you're there. It starts to have a tremendous economic impact that sort of far exceeded what anybody's expectations were. When you look at a Charlotte, for example, that number is astronomical. That park opened with an expected economic impact of $35 to $40 million per year. $7 million of that was expected to be internal. The remainder was to local businesses and the creation of jobs. They expected about 250 jobs peak season. In actuality, they have about a $22 million internal profit, or gross profit, I guess, they're spending there. They employ about 550 people on a peak year, or a peak season. And so the economic impacts are probably greater, more towards that $80 to $100 million. It's a very, very significant impact. They have 1 million people coming on site every year. About a quarter of those people are actually getting wet, and the rest are taking part in other activities. And so it can have a real impact to your bottom dollar. And when you're saying, hey, my little suburb around Dallas needs to have some tax dollars, how do we start to spur that? Or my little mountain town doesn't get visited very much, even though we love living here. We'd love to get some people into the shops. This is a great way to start to activate that space. And we talked a little bit about brand and a little bit about the impact of these parks. So I'll go through this slide pretty quickly, but I just threw up kind of in the first 6 months of Charlotte being open, where we started to see that brand expanding out to, and it was everything from Popular Science to Outside Magazine. We expected Outside Magazine, I guess, but everything from Popular Science to Outside Magazine. And it starts to drive the discussion about, hey, what am I going to do when I come to town? And so, for example, when the Democratic National, not to talk politics, but when the Democratic National Convention came to Charlotte and they started to say, here are the things you can do, the number one thing that people were advised to go do was go out and check out the Whitewater Center. The second thing in the town of Charlotte, North Carolina was go check out the NASCAR museum that they just opened, a NASCAR Hall of Fame. And so really we had changed the branding of that town to the point where this outdoor experience had exceeded NASCAR. And just to put that in perspective, if you look at the size of NASCAR, all of that business lives within about 20 miles of downtown Charlotte. And so it really is that the focal point of that. But even then, we started to exceed that brand in some ways. So I'm going to jump to the next one too. When we start to look at what these Whitewater centers do, we focus early on, and that's my background. I always kind of say, gosh, I was the tip of that, especially when we did Charlotte, the tip of that spear. I just raced in the Olympic team trials when we started designing this. I was still very active at the kind of top end of that sport. And what we've come to realize is, hey, that tip of the spear is important, but really gets people outdoors and gets people active, gets them living these healthy, active outdoor lifestyles, is if you create things that are accessible and attractive to everybody. And so this picture on the right is a great example where, hey, that core Whitewater experience is still there. That's our M-Wave. But at the same time, we've started to learn to say, hey, what about the people who don't want to get wet? What are they going to do? And so the ropes courses come in, the obstacle course comes in, the climbing wall comes in, the river festivals, people who just come out to live that outdoor lifestyle, put their hands next to the campfire and stay warm, or the outdoor barbecue fire, and then watch an outdoor concert or a local band playing in the outdoors. And so for us, these things have evolved in the way we think. Even those community parks, those smaller whitewater parks, from being something that's about whitewater to being something that's about the outdoor lifestyles. And these big pump parks are really outdoor lifestyle centers more than anything else. It's someplace where everybody who wants to get out and do something active, whether it's a walk or a competition or something, has something to do. And so we put a lot of time into designing for all those different lifestyles that are there. I wanted to talk a little bit about getting it done. I know Scott wants to jump in on this slide as well, but one of the things that we start with, or one of the things we've learned, is good projects come from good planning. And the idea of just saying, hey, I'm going to go spend a bunch of money and make a park, I hope it works out. One thing, you'll never get that project off the ground. But two, if you want to get through this funding thing and you want to get through this approvals thing, you need to do your homework on these things. And so when people are calling us up and they're saying, I want to paddle, what can I do? What we start asking right away is, hey, tell us about your town. Tell us about the people in your town. How many people do you hang out with and talk shop with, kayaking with? Is there drop there? Should we be thinking about a pumped park? What is your culture? I'm actually overseas right now in a place that doesn't have any natural whitewater. And so when we start to look at designing that whitewater, instead of chasing that upper level, what we're really saying is, what would not be intimidating to somebody who had never even really seen whitewater in their lives, and create that entry point and notch that up throughout the experience. And so understanding the culture that you're in. Also understanding the hurdle that's there. We have people call up and they're saying, we'd love to have whitewater. We start to learn a little bit more at their town. There's endangered species and we have to go through that permitting, or they don't own the land where they want to build the park. Or the water's allocated to hydro generation or things like that. And so understanding what that challenge will be, and in most cases, there's almost always a solution that gets you there. But at the end of the day, that process can be a winding road that's much longer if you have to go through a lot of approvals. More often than not, when we fly into somebody's town for that first initial kind of assessment of whether a park can be done or not, we're looking at what they're saying and saying, golly, FEMA's going to want to talk about this, Fish and Wildlife Service is going to want to talk about this. You've got 6 different municipalities that own the banks in this river, and we just think that's you're going to get snared into something. But look, you've got a canal right over here that we can change for almost nothing. And so we start looking right away at those options that are permittable, that are efficient, that we can chase after and are doable. I went in and looked at a river in Port Jervis near New York City at one point in time. And they started running through all the agencies that were involved in controlling the flow in that river. And by the end of the conversation, I was like, are you guys sure you want to do this? Because you could just go paddle over there and skip all that hassle, and that might save you a lot of time and effort on this. The last thing to understand, I think, is just what are your risks that are going on there. In particular, we start to look at what are the life safety risks of building in an area that you're in. Is there a big dam downstream, or do we create an attractive nuisance? But at the same time, we start also looking at what are your financial risks, and one of the things I focus on a lot, people are saying, hey, for example, the park in Vail, there's a $4.5 million economic impact from a single event in the Whitewater Park in Vail. They have this GoPro outdoor games, used to be the Teva Mountain Games. And it's a fantastic event, and it does wonderful things for a community that would otherwise be empty in the spring because ski season's over. But at the same time, it does it because they run a very good event run by very knowledgeable people, and they put a lot of time and effort into making sure that event comes off. And so when they say, can I have a $4.5 million event in my town? The answer is yes, but you need to operate. You need an operator that understands that. You need an operator that understands how to create an event that will attract that many people. And similar, the Charlotte Whitewater Park has a tremendous amount of profit. It's a very well-run organization. And if you walk around there and just try this, I shouldn't recommend this, but if I step up in the wrong place or take my helmet off on the Whitewater, there's always somebody there right away saying, hey, can you keep that on? Or can you be careful with that? Because that's outside our boundaries. They operate it very, very well. And this is something that Scott brings to the table with his background is how do you operate that park well and efficiently? Because if you don't have a plan for day one, you might as well not start with the design process, because that day one of operations is going to be one of your most challenging things. You want to jump that to the next slide. So for me, I go through kind of my background in grad school was design process, but one of the things that I like to start with is distilling all this knowledge down into a single, clearly defined goal. And so in every project, we're pulling that all together. And in fact, I do it for our company has a golden rule that we sort of stick to as well. I mean, the idea for me is, can you get it down to a one-liner that clearly articulates what you're doing? Because if you can't simplify what you're doing, you probably haven't thought it through enough. And so for some towns, the 2012 Olympics, for example, it was all about having the best Olympics that was ever there and then not losing your shirt when you finish having the games, right? But in other places, for example, where we are now, it's about creating something that's accessible to people who would not otherwise have access to whitewater or try that recreation and would be intimidated by it. And so understanding who those users are, and that we use a user-based design methodology, understanding all those different people who will use it, how they will use it, including your marketing team and your maintenance team, the church groups and the schools, the families and the competitors that will come, and then designing something special for each of those people is a big part of how you pull together a site where everybody walks in and says, hey, I was meant to be here. This is my place and I'm going to come back. So that's a big part of this design process as well. You want to jump into the next one? When you get to the actual design stage, and just to take a step back in those planning stages, a lot of that is done before you have your design team. Although we spend a lot of time on the phone every single day talking to people who are thinking about getting started down this pathway and saying, here's the planning steps you want to take. At some point in time, you want to hire a designer, an engineer team, or a management team that's capable of getting this project done. And I've seen both sides of that. I mean, there's sometimes people get involved with a team and they stew and they spin their wheels and they push against this sort of immovable door they can't get through. And other teams, and you should pick one that fits well for you, they're coming in and saying, look, we're going to get from where we are to people in boats as quickly as we can, and here's how we're going to do it. They have a great, for us, one of the things I believe is that great projects come from great project management. So we manage a project, we set a schedule, we create deadlines, we create deliverables that match what we need to do to get that project moving forward. And so so defining a doable project that has a set start and a set finish, and then managing that project throughout of it. Understanding what those stages of design are and those stages of permitting are, so that you aren't missing deadlines, especially in a natural river where you miss that construction window for 1 year and get pushed to the next. It's very important to understand how that process works sort of from start to finish. And then the last one I always look at, and this is very important for whitewater parks, is this design for X. And that's not my term. That's a design term. But the idea of just sitting down day after day and saying, what is that X factor? How do we design it for a flood? How do we design it for that day that it's got 30,000 people and they're watching the Olympic team trials? How do we design it for a day when the conveyor belt breaks down? What are they going to do that day? How do we design it for the day they want to do trail running and kayaking at the same time? And so running through this X factor and understanding what those things are and how people are going to use them. And so that design for X for us is a big one. And a part of that, and I threw up this picture from the 2012 Olympics, but designing it for its best day and its worst day. And if you look at that picture on the left, and you start to count all the little white tents that are everywhere in there, and all the access ways and the secure areas and the fences, the idea in this course was how do we host an event with 10,000, 15,000 spectators, TV coverage, elite athletes, security? How do we fit that all in our venue? And at the same time, how is that venue worth it to do anything else on 2 months later or 3 months later when the mess is all cleaned up? And so, so we've learned to create these overlays that say, hey, here's what our event overlay looks like. Here's what our winter configuration looks like. Here's what our summer configuration looks like. So that when people show up, they have something special that's there that allows them to do it very easily. And I'll give you an example. You know, we build these parks for freestyle events like the Highway Whitewater Park in New Zealand. In that park, as we were building it, terribly windy, lots of weather, lots of rain. And so we designed it for these event tents. And if you go in there and you set up your event tent and you say, it's going to be windy today, we're going to bolt it down, let's find a place to tie it down, you'll find the anchors hidden in the rocks. Because we knew they would put the tent up there. We knew they would anchor it down. And in fact, I went back to the grand opening. It was a windy day. Tents were anchored down on all four corners. And we thought, yep, that wouldn't have happened had it not been for this idea of thinking through all these different overlays that are there. So taking that to the extreme in this Olympic configuration, but it's something where careful planning helps you make sure your park gets used as much as it can be used.
All right, I guess I'll jump in, Scott, and just build on a couple of things you said, and then we'll turn it over to questions. From the park side, I think it's key that the expectations for impact be understood as the parks director point of view. You know, there's going to be a lot of enthusiasm for these projects up front. They're almost intoxicating to some officials. But you want to be careful when you open this, thinking about community shift. Is your goal the immediate economic impact, or is your goal something broader? Because that's going to define what success is and how you structure them. And I can't tell you how many times I've been through this with communities where it's like, yeah, I want a whitewater park for the economic impact or all that, but they really were more interested in the community shift and what it did for Scott for branding. So I think it's important that you thoughtfully approach that and that you understand what the goal is, because it'll shape what you build ultimately and what you design. The next thing is your elected officials' comfort with risk and adventure. And this is one I've had successes and quite frankly some failures on, is you have to have an appreciation that outdoor recreation is different than a walking trail. These are wild environments, and we use words like safety and risk management. But the fact is, when you have outdoor rec, be it a ski hill, be it a mountain bike trail, whatever it is, you know, accidents happen. There are consequences for recreation. I would argue that's what makes it real and actually is what makes it worth doing. But you have to have a level of comfort with that, because that pivots to your agency or your organization's capacity for outdoor rec. This is different than running a basketball court. This is different than running a trail system. You have to have a lot of thought, as Scott mentioned, in terms of pre-planning, in terms of your assessments to deliver these, because day X will happen. And I always find it wise to know that going into it up front, because it can just produce some clarity on decision making if your folks are ready to jump into it or not. Scott hit upon it. We hit this a lot in the States, particularly in the East Coast. Issues of water quality are absolutely huge. I called an article earlier today. Apparently you can now eat fish out of the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland. Who would have ever thought that was possible? That relates to outdoor rec. We are cleaning up our water, but we have a lot of psychological barriers between getting people in the water, and you need to know your water quality, particularly if you're in free moving water, and understand, you know, when is it good to go in, when is it not to go in close consultation with your departments of water quality at the state and local level, so you understand that. Because I think this world, according to me, my interest in outdoor rec sometimes is even broader. I know people care about what they enjoy and consume. And if I get people to enjoy something, then that'll lead to a wiser view of that resource maybe, and a little bit more thorough understanding of why it's important, and going up to bat for it. But then you're walking a thin line. So you need to know that going into it. We're working now on the Ohio River. The Ohio River, by most measures, is the most polluted waterway in North America. So when we are thinking our way, with Scott's help, about water access, how do we get people on that water in a way that's safe, we're having to walk very carefully through that, because there are serious concerns and serious risks that we need to think about. The next thing is seasonal availability, and all this is guided towards all water parks. Sometimes rivers are low. Sometimes they're low at the peak months of when you want activity. So you need to understand how your water levels for recreation relate to your seasonal use patterns. And that's the key one, because again, East Coast, a lot of times our best whitewater experiences on our free-flowing rivers are March and April, which can be very cold. So you can have issues of hypothermia if you don't have the right gear. You can have issues of safety with high, swimming in cold water rather than warm water in July. So thinking your way through the seasonality with the water level, we find to be very, very important, because the last thing you want to do is build some huge amenity that in July and August and September, your peak visitation months, may not be floatable or enjoyable, or you build it so that it is enjoyable in those months. The next one is your first responder capacity and interest. When bad things happen, it's not going to be the Parks Department generally that is called on these moving waters. It's your fire department, your rescue department, those folks. Having them engaged at the very beginning, we think, is important, because it's their resources that are going to be needed, and you need to have that safety plan baked into your design. Where do they get access? What equipment do they need to have access when things go wrong? Do they need to clear rivers of strainers pre-season, after season? These are the sort of considerations that you don't want to do 3 days before you open. These need to be thought of well in advance, and really lean into it. Lean into it with worst case scenario, because that will only help you down the road for what Scott calls, day X that's out there.
Well, and I think there's a part of these community considerations that I think people need to be thinking about, as well as how does it benefit the rest of your community in the same way and how are they going to use it? And so a great example is the Swiftwater Rescue. In our initial parks, what we found was we were talking to these fire departments and rescue folks about how to come down and help us. If we have that event, if we push the emergency button or somebody has a heart attack along the channel, how do we get them in there? What's the handshake between our staff and our operations people and their people who are coming rushing in, so that we give them the best coordination we can? What we found is they're actually coming out and using our whitewater parks to train in, to the point where we actually build a whitewater park now. We've built several of these whitewater parks where one part or the whole part is actually built just for Swiftwater rescue training. And so they're coming in and saying, hey, we want to be ready for the next Katrina or the next Houston. Can we do that Swiftwater rescue training with you? Can we put a vehicle in your channels and train on vehicle rescues? Can we do self-rescues and ropes things? And so sometimes these community considerations you have actually lead to partnerships that help you get that park funded and built in the long run. And that Swiftwater Rescue is a great example of that.
That's a great input. I'd add a couple other quick thoughts here. One is maintenance. Maintenance on these is different. Again, East Coast versus West Coast. When we have a big major flood event back here, silt management, silt loads become a huge issue. Strainers become a huge issue. In Boise, Idaho, where I was previously, they don't have that same silt load. They have a different reservoir system, so how things respond and how they maintain those is a different deal. And that's going to relate to all the permits and all the agencies you talk about. The key takeaway, understanding you're working in suddenly a dynamic environment, and things are going to change and stuff is going to happen. So being aware of that, leaning into it. This is not, I found with some folks that may come from a development world, they're used to building a building, and the building is done and finished when it's handed over, and that's it. Well, with these critters, like a lot of parks with growing in trees, forests, and everything else, this is a dynamic, changing environment. It gets more exciting and more challenging once it's open versus construction for keeping them running. Big water becomes a big issue, and how you manage access, when you control access, who can get in, who can't. There are great models out there. The National Park Service at the New River Gorge, I think, actually has the best model for managing big water and how you control access on these things. So there's people you can learn from that have a lot more experience than me on it, but something to consider. We mentioned the seasonality for operations. The seasonal swings on these things are different than you may see elsewhere. You may suddenly, with Whitewater Moving Water, have a season that's a spring-loaded deal, which is ahead of your summer peak. Well, you may also have a dam release schedule. I'm thinking of the Gauley River in West Virginia, where dam releases create a winter or even a late fall season. So understanding the seasonality and how that relates to staff is critical, because, as we all know in the parks business, a lot of part-time staffing and things like that are out of our control as it relates to the availability of employees that can work for you. Scott mentioned revenue opportunities for Lifestyle Center far better than I can. They're there. Don't downplay them. You have revenue streams that actually have nothing to do likely with these. With on-water, you can generate revenue from the off-water, the spectators, the lifestyle, or what we would call the community building elements around them as well. And then that leads to a very important decision we all make daily on the make-buy for programming on the water. Let's say you build, or you decide to build one of these. Well, you'll have to make a decision. Do you want to run it? You want to contract out that service? Working your way through those models, understanding that each solution for each community is a little different, is very important. You just don't cut what someone else did at another location. You may have operations.
Hey, Scott, this is Hannah. You're cutting out a little bit.
Okay, I'll stand closer if I can. The next thing, of course, is just understand this isn't Field of Dreams stuff. It's not just for millennials, man. These parks, they serve everybody. So keep an eye on that. Don't let yourself become prisoner to one audience group that may look like me. Understanding these serve everybody and owning that space, because this is a lifetime activity in the same way golf and tennis are lifetime activities, or hiking. So we're kind of pushing through that with good design to allow us to get there. And Scott hit it. Your community's culture matters. There are examples of these parks being very successful in Boulder, Colorado, and we all say, well, duh, yeah, that I get it, or Boise, that makes sense. They can equally be successful in a Charlotte if you understand and connect to your existing culture. For me in Louisville, and working in this margin now, if we move into the Whitewater business, I know that this community is all about events. I know my community is all about being with their friends. So we may structure how we connect that existing culture to the resource differently than we would have done in, say, a Boise or a Bend. And that's just understanding the community context in which I work in. So we've talked a lot, and I want to give the last couple minutes for questions. In summary, I think Scott and I both believe that these urban densities, they provide a new venue for whitewater sports. The technology has evolved with his work that allows us to build features that weren't previously possible. We like the experience of whitewater because it's a consumptive, it's an experience thing, better than shopping, nanner. I like it because no two rivers or parks are the same. You cannot duplicate this stuff, and no one can steal it from you. So what you have will be unique and special on your own. The dynamic nature of these just attracts energy. They're just, and I'm going to press on this again, these are just different. They're special. There's something about, I'm sure it's the ozone or something at the bottom, but something really magical happens when you put people in close proximity to moving water. Way that I've unique. Well, the program parks focus this activity. They can build communities. The well-managed parks have been game changers. The ones that haven't been managed, ones that have been kind of I'll build it and then forget about it, haven't. So understand that active engagement starts on day one and it has to stay. And then, of course, there's a level of complexity with these. You must know your blank to jump into this work because it is complex, it is variable. And don't let this 1% user, I enjoy class 5 whitewater, that's my vision, I'm going to be on the cover of Outside Magazine, drive your decision or your design. Design to the broadest audience possible and let it be your anchor. So I hope we delivered on these intended learnings. Scott, do you have any closing comments before we turn it to Hannah for questions?
I don't. Yeah, I'm looking forward to these questions.
Hannah, you have control.
Thank you both for this insightful presentation. I would love to have a park like this in Indiana. Which brings us to our first question here from Spalding Hurst, Viking Canoe Club. They've asked, what is possible at the site of the River Heritage Conservancy's Ohio River Greenway? And is there enough gradient down below the falls?
That is a specific project question if I've ever heard one. We are evaluating all of those options right now, and we are right in the middle of what Scott touched upon, which is We have identified the partners that are at the table, and there are a lot, and have begun the initial dialogue with them on what's possible, what's realistic, what's risky, what's not, while we get into that work. And it is very complex on the Ohio. For those of you that don't know the Ohio, by some measures, it's either the third or fourth largest volume river in the United States as it moves through Louisville. We're talking about 300,000 to 500,000 cubic feet per second. So it is a massive challenge, which is different than a lot of other river parks where these have been done. So to answer the question, we are now in the evaluation and study phase and dialogue phase, and we're introducing Whitewater to some friends at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that it is new to them. So we're talking about professionals, top of their career, have a lot of experience in moving water, but we are a brand new constituency up on the scene.
I will say, first off, hi to Spalding, and second, there's some tremendous opportunities out there in the river. It's also a great example of one of those rivers where when you say, you know, golly, what's my hurdle to getting started? You know, how that water runs in the Ohio and when it runs and how it floods and you know, there's some great waves that are out there. Managing usage of those waves in the context of shipping on the Ohio River and water level requirements in these cities is very difficult to do. And so in that case, we're looking at a bunch of different options that say, hey, what creates that recreation on a day-to-day basis and what creates these special events that we can predict, you know, so.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, what is currently the southernmost whitewater venue in the lower 48 states?
Oh, a trivia question. San Marcos, Texas, I would think. Scott, you?
I would say, yeah, you're right. I mean, Columbus, Georgia is a great, wonderful river city now that's done a great job too, but I think San Marcos is further south. Of course, the Rio Grande probably has some white water in it too, but I'll let that sit for more important officials.
Great. Next question is, can you recommend any grant funding opportunities that are specific to building or operating whitewater river parks?
I'll jump on it, then Scott, maybe you have a piece. I would suggest these amenities are uniquely positioned for private donors and private foundations. I've found unique connectivity between the donor communities because of the community change that they can impact. If I look back at Boise, we did a river rec plan there back in 96, 97, and private donors showed up to kickstart what became the river rec park there with private funds, I believe what, Scott, around 2001, 2002. And Charlotte was a privately led initiative as well. So I encourage you to look at your local private foundations as a possible, you know, they love being disruptors. It fits a lot of their instincts. Scott?
You know, there's a bunch of grants out there you can look at as well. Community development block grants. We've seen some projects funded that way. In Colorado, they have Great Outdoors Colorado. So our lottery funds actually do go to outdoor recreation in Colorado. And so there's opportunities there as well. The private fundraising is a big one. The single best fundraising mechanism that I've seen, though, is beating the drum. You know, if you get down to City Hall and you say, guys, this is a game changer. Let's make a river park in downtown. Once they start to see what those river parks look like and how they function, most towns that are river towns are saying, this is a no-brainer. We're going to do it and we're going to fund it and here's how we're going to do it. And so a lot of times when it seems insurmountable and they're saying you're going to have to raise your own money, just by beating that drum and building a coalition of people in your community that believes in these parks, you can create a funding structure right there. And when your town or city starts to help you apply for grants, that's where you really start to get the results in terms of either funding directly through your community or getting results from state and local grants.
Yeah, two other little additions here. One, look at your state comprehensive outdoor recreation plan. Increasingly now, thanks to the state agencies are looking at boating more seriously than they have in the past. It may be previously just been for fishing or motorized recreation. Look to that, and then look towards your fish and wildlife agencies as potential partnerships for, in particular, dam removal projects, which may offer some low-hanging fruit for these amenities. This is all about Venn diagrams, and however many partners you can pull to the table really help. And generally, fish and wildlife agencies at the state level in the states have had a lot more engagement on rivers historically than parks and rec agencies.
Great ideas, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? We have about 5 minutes left. Would like to note that continuing education is available on our website, provalenslearning.com. If you want more information, you can always email me, and I will add my email address here in the chat box. If you have questions, please feel free to type in the chat box or use your microphone, whatever you prefer. I can answer this question. Is the presentation available to download and share with others? So Scott, if that is okay with you guys, I can post this presentation on our website, and then the recording will also be available as well.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. So I kind of have a question. If you were to go look at a site, what would be some major red flags? Like if you were to look at a site, and what might stand out that you're like, no, this is definitely not a good location for a park?
I can answer that. You know, the first thing I'll say, and this is the conversation I probably have 3 times a day with people who are calling on the phone, but every project starts with a concept and feasibility study. And so you want to get somebody in there that knows where those pitfalls are. You want to get somebody in there that knows what a feasible plan and a feasible budget are to get that moving. Because when you're talking about getting approval at the city or county level, what they want to know is, what is it? How does it function? How do we get it done? What are the steps from where we are now to getting it done? And the last thing is, what's it going to cost? And so having that information and going back to your city council and saying, I want to talk about this, here's what we've learned, that's the best way to get these off the ground. And when we're coming into these sites, people are saying, hey, I've got this great thing. One of the ones that's a quintessential example was a project we looked at in North Carolina, and they came in and they said, we want the project where this wave is. And the wave was right below an existing dam. It was right in the floodway. It was a restored area already. And there was Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA and all these people getting involved in our meetings. And on the way up, we drove past a failing old dam. It's a bunch of stacked marble that went right to the level of the road almost, And so we had the conversation, and these guys were locked into, we want to fix this wave up and make it bigger than what it is. And at some point in time in the meeting, I said, I realize there's a lot of challenges here. Has anybody thought about going down to the dam that's failing anyway? Can we work there? And literally everybody at the agency, the agency level was saying, that's a great place to work. In fact, we'll help you fund it. And everybody who was at the table who was a paddler, it's like, nah, let's do it here. And the project never got off the ground, And so when we're coming in, we're looking at whether or not they have public access, whether there's parking, whether the project is permittable in the context of what species are there and who owns the water and what the local politics and the local habitat situation is. And so for us, those red flags really come down to those things. You can't build it on somebody else's land unless they give permission. You can't build it somewhere where there's an existing water diversion with a water right that they don't want to see it happen. And so we're looking for all these little pitfalls that could lead to it. And quite honestly, we often have a site that we prefer and a backup site that we advance for a while until we can vet all those issues so we don't waste time.
Great information, thank you. Looks like it's 11 o'clock, so that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for taking the time to share with us today. I've really learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did as well. If you have questions, please email me at worldparksacademy@gmail.com, and look out for our next webinars in the coming months. Thank you both.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Have a great day.